The autumn assembly at Stanthorpe Hall had been arranged for his homecoming, and every person in the county knew it. 300 candles burned in the long ballroom. The orchestra had been hired from Bath. Lady Stanthorpe, the Dowager Countess, had positioned herself at the center of the receiving line in gray silk and diamonds, her goddaughter Miss Sophia Fenton beside her in white, and the two of them together formed a wall of expectation so polished it could have been set in a portrait frame. The room waited. Margaret Ellison, standing near the far wall in a borrowed gown that did not quite reach her wrists, waited too, though no one had asked her to. She had been told to attend. Lady Stanthorpe required her companion present at public functions, the way one required a second footman or a vase of hothouse flowers for the appearance of a full household. Margaret's role was to stand, to hold a glass she would not drink, and to be available if the dowager needed a shawl fetched or a name whispered. She was 24 years old. She had held this position for 19 months. Her father had died owing £200 to 3 creditors whose letters still arrived at the vicarage she no longer occupied, and the £15 Lady Stanthorpe paid her each year was not generosity. It was purchase. The doors opened at 8:30. The room turned, and Edward Hale, the 6th Earl of Stanthorpe, walked into the light. The scar ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, a seam of ruined tissue that pulled the skin taut and twisted his expression into something the candlelight could not soften. His left eye sat in a hollow of puckered flesh. The jaw beneath it was rigid, locked, as though he had set it against the room before he entered, and would not release it until he left. He was 31 years old. He had been handsome once. Every woman in the county remembered it, and every woman in the county looked away from what he had become. Sophia Fenton's smile held for precisely 2 seconds before her gaze dropped to his cravat. Lady Stanthorpe's hand tightened on her fan. The nearest cluster of guests shifted, a collective half-step backward that the orchestra's playing could not cover. Margaret saw it. She saw the way the room rearranged itself around his damage, the way conversation resumed a register too bright, the way no one quite faced him. He stopped 6 paces inside the door. His eyes moved across the room with the flat efficiency of a man who had learned to inventory a field. They passed over Sophia. They passed over his mother. They found Margaret. She did not look away. She met his gaze and held it. And then she curtsied. The same plain curtsy she would have offered any gentleman who entered a room where she stood. She rose. He was still watching her. His jaw had not softened, his posture had not changed, and yet something behind the scar, something in the undamaged eye, registered her like a sound heard in a quiet corridor. Lady Stanthorpe leaned toward Sophia and spoke without turning her head. "The vicar's girl," she said. "Do not concern yourself with her." If you have ever stood in a room where someone's worth was decided before she spoke, you already know what Margaret carried across that ballroom floor. Stay close. This story remembers her. The position of companion to the Dowager Countess of Stanthorpe was not a kindness. It was a ledger entry. Margaret rose at 6, laid out Lady Stanthorpe's correspondence by 7, read aloud from the London papers by 8, and spent the hours between breakfast and luncheon copying invitations in a hand so careful it ached in her fingers by noon. She mended the dowager's lace. She sorted the dowager's silks by season. She answered the dowager's bell, which rang with the regularity of a parish clock and the warmth of a parish clock's mechanism. She ate in the morning room alone, at a small table by the window, where the draught came through a gap in the casement that no one had repaired, because no one who sat at that table had ever been worth the glazier's fee. She was not seated with the family. She was not dismissed with the servants. She occupied the exact corridor of rank that permitted Lady Stanthorpe to summon her at any hour without impropriety, and to forget her at every meal without discourtesy. Her gowns were 2 in number, both inherited from a cousin in Gloucestershire who had the advantage of wider shoulders and shorter arms, and Margaret had let out the hems herself with thread she purchased from her own wages. Her shoes were worn at the heel. Her hands, which had once turned pages in her father's study with the ease of someone who belonged among books, now turned pages at another woman's direction, and the difference between those 2 turnings was the whole of her diminishment. Her father, the Reverend James Ellison, had served the parish of Stanthorpe for 22 years. He had baptized Edward Hale. He had buried the old Earl. He had kept his sermons short and his debts quiet until the debts grew louder than the sermons, and when he died of a fever in the January of 1814, Margaret discovered that the vicarage roof had been mortgaged twice over, and the bookseller in Cheltenham was owed £40 for volumes her father had ordered and never opened, £200 in total. She had no mother, no brother, no aunt with a spare bedroom, and a willingness to absorb a clergyman's daughter with ink on her cuffs. Lady Stanthorpe had offered the position 3 days after the funeral, and Margaret had accepted it the way a swimmer accepts a plank in open water, without gratitude and without choice. Edward had been at war when Margaret arrived. She had known him only as a portrait in the East Gallery, a young man with an uncomplicated jaw and dark eyes that looked past the painter toward something the canvas could not hold. His younger brother, Lieutenant Thomas Hale, had been painted beside him. Thomas had the lighter coloring, the easier smile. Thomas had been 23 years old in the portrait. Thomas had died at Waterloo, and no one in the household spoke of it unless Lady Stanthorpe spoke of it first. And Lady Stanthorpe spoke of it only to say that Edward had come home and Thomas had not, and that the living owed the dead the dignity of correct comportment. Margaret had read the casualty lists in the Morning Post. She had read the dispatches from Brussels. She had read, in a letter Lady Stanthorpe left unsealed on the writing desk, the surgeon's summary of what the French sabre had done to the left side of Edward Hale's face. She had not been meant to read it. She read it the way she read everything in this house, because knowledge was the only currency she could accumulate without being charged for it. Now he was home, and the household had rearranged itself around him the way the ballroom had. The servants moved through corridors with exaggerated care, as though volume itself might disturb the thing his face had become. Sophia Fenton arrived for luncheon 3 times a week, and each time she sat at his right, and each time she addressed the candelabra rather than the man beside it. Lady Stanthorpe maintained a ceaseless bright commentary across every silence Edward allowed to settle, filling his quiet the way one fills a crack in a wall, not to mend it but to prevent anyone from seeing how deep it went. Margaret filled none of his silences. She had not been invited to. The library at Stanthorpe Hall ran the full length of the East Wing, and Margaret had claimed it as her own at 6 o'clock each morning, the hour when the household slept, and the shelves belonged to no one. She read theology, she read natural history, she read Cowper and Pope and the sermons her father had annotated in margins so small the words looked like insect tracks. She read because her mind required it, and because the library was the one room in the house where her presence left no evidence Lady Stanthorpe could object to. On the 9th morning after the assembly, she arrived at 6 and found him already there. He stood at the window with his back to the door, his coat still buttoned, a small leather-bound volume held open in one hand. The scar faced the gray light. He did not turn when the door opened, and for a moment Margaret stood on the threshold with her hand still on the latch, and her breath held against the intrusion she had already committed. "Miss Ellison." He spoke without turning. His voice was lower than she had expected, stripped of the commanding projection she had heard in officers' dispatches, worn to something that sounded almost like fatigue. "My lord, forgive me. I did not know you were here." "Sit down, Miss Ellison." He still did not turn. "You were here first. I have merely arrived earlier." She sat. He remained at the window. The small leather volume stayed open in his hand, and she could see from the angle of his wrist that he was not reading it. He was holding it the way one holds a wound closed, with pressure and without looking. Minutes passed. The clock on the mantel marked them. Margaret opened her own book, a volume of Cowper she had read 4 times, and did not read it now. She was aware of exactly where he stood in the room. She was aware of the precise distance between his shoulder and the nearest shelf. Her pulse had settled into a rhythm she did not recognize, something slower and more deliberate than the ordinary pace of a morning, as though her body had decided to match the quiet he carried and would not be argued out of it. "You were at the assembly," he said. "Yes, my lord." "You did not look away." The sentence sat in the air between them. Margaret set her book in her lap and considered several responses, all of them deflections, all of them the kind of careful nothing she had learned to offer Lady Stanthorpe when a direct answer might cost her the position. She chose none of them. "No," she said. "I did not." He turned then. The scar faced her fully. The morning light was not kind to it, and she did not need it to be. His undamaged eye held hers, and in it she saw something she would spend the next several weeks refusing to name. Recognition. The specific, weighted recognition of a man who had been looked away from by every face he trusted, and who had just found one that did not flinch. "Why?" he said. "Because you walked into a room, my lord. Not into a hospital." He closed the leather volume. He looked at her for a moment longer than propriety permitted, and then he left the library without another word. The door closed behind him. Margaret's hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against the Cowper and held them there until they stopped. He was in the library the next morning, and the morning after that. He never explained his presence. He never invited hers. He arrived before 6. She arrived at 6. And for 20 minutes or 30 minutes or once nearly an hour, they occupied the same room in a silence that was not uncomfortable and was not empty. He read. She read. The distance between their chairs did not change, and neither of them remarked on it, and the household did not know. The fire he had lit those first mornings became a settled fact, the way seasons become settled facts, and Margaret arrived each day to a warm room without acknowledging who had warmed it. She was aware of the sound of his breathing. She was aware that he turned pages more slowly than any reader she had known, as though each page were a door he was deciding whether to open. She was aware that when she shifted in her chair, his hand stilled on whatever page he held, and that the stillness lasted precisely as long as her movement, and no longer. Once, reaching for a volume on the high shelf, she lost her balance on the library steps and caught herself against the rail. He was beside her in 2 strides. His hand closed around her elbow, steadied her, and released before she could form the word, "Thank you." He was back in his chair by the time she descended, the leather volume open in his lap, and neither of them spoke of it. The place on her elbow, where his fingers had been, stayed warm for the rest of the morning. A small, specific heat she could not account for, and did not try to explain away. On the 4th morning, she sneezed in the cold, and he said, without looking up, "There is a fire laid in the grate. Light it." On the 5th morning, she arrived without her shawl, and he said, "You are cold. Take the blanket from the settee." On the 6th morning, she did not eat breakfast before coming, and he set a bread roll on the table beside her chair and said nothing at all. Commands. Each one syntactically an order, functionally a shelter. Margaret heard the authority in his voice and did not yet hear the tenderness beneath it. She lit the fire. She took the blanket. She ate the bread roll. She told herself she was merely following the instructions of the Earl in his own house. And her body, which knew better than her mind, flushed warm at the back of her neck each time he spoke. It was on the 7th morning that she saw him do the thing she could not explain away. She had been walking from the lodge toward the kitchen garden when she passed the East Cottages, where the Pratt family had wintered for 3 generations. Mrs. Pratt's youngest, a boy of 4 named William, had been ill with a cough that would not break, and Margaret had been bringing broth from the kitchen each afternoon. She did not mention this to Lady Stanthorpe. She did not mention it to anyone. She brought the broth in a covered pot. She sat with the child. She read to him from a book of fables until his breathing eased, and she walked back to the house with the empty pot under her arm and her shoes muddy to the ankle. That morning, William's fever had climbed. Margaret knelt beside the low bed, felt his forehead with the back of her hand, and understood from the heat beneath her fingers that the cough had turned to something worse. She removed her own shawl, the only one she owned, the one with the mended fringe, and wrapped it around his thin shoulders. She poured water from the pitcher and held the cup to his mouth. She smoothed the hair from his face, and when he cried, she did not tell him to be brave, because she had learned from her father's parish that telling a frightened child to be brave was a way of saying his fear inconvenienced you. She sang to him instead. She did not sing well. The song was one her father had sung to her when she was very small, a hymn about a sparrow in winter, and she sang it quietly because the room was small, and the child was frightened, and her voice was the only warm thing she had left to give. William's hand found hers, and she held it. And the song continued past its final verse, because she could not bring herself to stop, while his grip was still tight. She did not know Edward was standing at the cottage door. She did not know he had followed the path from the house and had seen her enter. She did not know that he stood in the doorframe for the full length of the hymn, with his hand against the wood and his face, the damaged half and the whole half together, held in an expression that no one in the county had seen him wear since he came home. He left before she turned. She found the shawl returned to her chair in the library the next morning, folded with a precision that was not Mrs. Hewitt's. Lady Stanthorpe hosted a card party the following Thursday. Margaret was stationed in the corner with the dowager's embroidery basket, which she was expected to sort without being seen to sort it. Sophia Fenton sat at the first table, resplendent in primrose muslin, her laughter calibrated to carry across the room without appearing to try. Edward sat at the second table and played without speaking, his scarred profile turned toward the wall. "The vicar's girl forgets her place," Lady Stanthorpe said, loud enough for the nearest 3 tables to hear. Margaret had committed the crime of handing Edward a fresh cup of tea when his sat cold and untouched at his elbow. "A companion serves the dowager, not the Earl. Miss Fenton, perhaps you might see to my son's comfort." Sophia rose. Margaret sat. The tea remained where Margaret had placed it, and Edward did not drink from the cup Sophia brought. His hand rested on the edge of the table, and for a single moment, no longer than a caught breath, his fingers turned toward Margaret's corner of the room as though orienting to a sound no one else could hear. The escalation was patient and thorough. Lady Stanthorpe did not shout. She did not need to. She adjusted Margaret's world 1 degree at a time, the way one adjusts a vice, so that the pressure was always present and never dramatic enough to name. She began seating Margaret at the far end of the table at mealtimes, then at a separate small table by the window, then at no table at all on evenings when guests were present. She began sending Margaret on errands that kept her from the library before 7, errands so precisely timed that Margaret understood they were not tasks. They were walls. She instructed Sophia to walk the East Garden with Edward each afternoon, and Sophia walked, and Edward walked beside her, and Margaret watched once from the upper window and saw that he did not offer Sophia his arm, and that Sophia did not reach for it, and that the space between them was the space between two people performing a duty neither had chosen. When Margaret happened to cross the garden path one Tuesday, the dowager's note arrived at her room within the hour, written in the dowager's own hand, which she reserved for directives she wished to be understood as personal. Your duties do not require the garden. Confine your exercise to the west lawn. Margaret confined herself. The west lawn was a narrow strip of grass between the kitchen wall and the orchard fence, out of view of the house's principal windows, a place where even the gardener's boy did not linger. She walked there each afternoon with her hands clasped behind her back and her face turned toward the gray November sky, and she told herself that the contraction of her world was temporary and manageable, and that she had survived worse contractions, though when she tried to name a worse one, she could not. She read Cowper in her room by the light of a single tallow candle. She wrote her father's creditors with quarterly payments of £1, 3 shillings. She pressed her hands together in her lap each evening and told herself that the mornings in the library had meant nothing, that the bread roll had been courtesy, that the returned shawl had been household management, and that the way her chest tightened when she heard his footstep in the corridor was a deficiency of character she would master with sufficient discipline. She could not master it. Her body was honest when her mind was not. She heard his voice through a closed door, and her breath shortened. She saw his hand on a banister and felt the warmth at the back of her neck rise without permission. She sat in the small pew at Sunday services and knew, without turning, exactly where he sat, the way one knows where a hearth is in a cold room. The wound he carried was not only the scar. Margaret learned this not from him, not from the household, but from the book. The small leather-bound volume he carried in his coat pocket and held open without reading. On a morning in late October, he left it on the library table. She did not mean to open it. She opened it. The handwriting inside was not Edward's. It was younger, looser, the script of someone who wrote quickly because his thoughts outran his pen. The name on the flyleaf read, Thomas Hale, and the pages were filled with verse, some copied from published poets, some original, all of them annotated in a second hand, smaller and more deliberate, that she recognized as Edward's. In the margins, Edward had written dates: June 12th, June 14th, June 17th. The last annotation, beside a stanza about horses crossing a river at dawn, read simply, the morning before. Margaret closed the book. She set it exactly where he had left it. She understood now what the morning silence had contained, and why his hands held the volume the way they did, and why the dowager spoke of Thomas only to say that the living owed the dead correct comportment, because to say more than that would require naming the thing Edward carried, and the thing Edward carried was this: he had been Thomas's commanding officer. He had ordered the charge at Waterloo. The French cavalry had broken through the left flank, and the order to advance had been his, given in the field under fire, given because the manual demanded it, and because hesitation would have cost the regiment. Thomas had followed. Thomas had always followed his elder brother, in the nursery and in the schoolroom, and across the muddy fields of Belgium on a June morning that smelled of powder and horses and rain. Thomas had not come back. Edward had come back with a face the saber had halved and a guilt the surgeons could not reach, and every morning in the library, in the silence he shared with Margaret and with no one else, he sat with the book his brother had carried into battle and read the verse his brother would never finish annotating. If you have held someone's silence and felt the weight of what lived inside it, You know what Margaret felt in that library with the book closed beneath her hands. Sometimes the bravest thing a person does is simply not look away. She returned the book to his chair before he arrived the next morning. He said nothing about it. His eyes found hers across the room, and in that look she saw the question he would not ask, and in the steadiness with which she met it, he found the answer he had not believed possible. That someone could see the full shape of what he had done and still be in the room. November brought frost and the Dowager's final campaign. Lady Stanthorpe called Margaret to the morning room on a Tuesday and informed her, in the same tone she used to order coal, that Edward had agreed to marry Sophia Fenton. The banns would be read at Advent. The engagement would be announced formally at the Stanthorpe Christmas ball. Margaret's services would no longer be required after the new year, as the household would be restructured to suit a bride's establishment. "You have been adequate," the Dowager said. "I will write you a character." The Ashby family in Devon requires a governess, and they are not particular about connections. She paused. "You understand, of course, that my son requires a wife of appropriate station. Miss Fenton has been prepared for this since her debut. The season will not accommodate a vicar's girl." Margaret stood very still. Her hands were at her sides. Her face gave nothing. Because she had spent 19 months learning to give nothing in this room. And the cost of that discipline was a pressure behind her breastbone that she could not name and would not release. "Yes, my lady," she said. She went to her room. She packed her trunk. She placed her father's Bible on top, and the letters from the creditors, and the single volume of Cowper she had been permitted to keep. The borrowed gowns she left folded on the bed, because they were not hers, and had never been hers. And the act of folding them neatly, of smoothing the fabric where her body had shaped it, felt like the closing of an account she had never been credited in. She did not go to the library. She did not seek Edward. She sat on the edge of the bed with her trunk at her feet and her hands in her lap, and permitted herself, for the first time in 19 months, the specific grief of wanting something she had no right to want. She had not named it. She would not name it now. She would take the position in Devon. She would read to other people's children and mend other people's lace and walk other people's west lawns. And in time, the memory of a warm library and a bread roll and a hand at her elbow would fade to the texture of something she had read in a book rather than something she had lived. It was Mrs. Hewitt, the housekeeper, who found her at the servants' stair with her trunk. "Miss Ellison," she said, "he does not know. The Earl does not know what she has told you. He has agreed to nothing." Margaret looked at her. "The Dowager told Miss Fenton this morning. She told you this afternoon. She has not told him at all." Mrs. Hewitt's hands were knotted in her apron. "I heard the vicar's girl was being sent away," she said, her voice dropping, "and I thought someone ought to say it plainly." The third voicing of the label, delivered not as cruelty now, but as recognition. The vicar's girl. Spoken by a woman who meant it the way one means a name one has grown fond of. Margaret set her trunk down. She did not unpack it. She waited. The Stanthorpe Christmas ball filled the long ballroom with the same 300 candles, the same orchestra from Bath, the same county families in their winter silks. Sophia Fenton wore ice blue satin. Lady Stanthorpe wore her diamonds. Margaret stood near the far wall in the same borrowed gown, her trunk still packed in her room above, her hands folded and her chin level, and the pressure behind her breastbone so constant. Now she had stopped noticing it, the way one stops noticing the weight of a coat worn all winter. The room had been told. Not formally. Not by Edward. Not by any announcement that carried his name. Lady Stanthorpe had whispered, and her whispers had the force of proclamation in this county. Miss Fenton was to be the next countess. The matter was settled. The vicar's girl would be gone by 12th night. Edward entered late. He wore black, as he had worn black at the autumn assembly, and the scar caught the candlelight the same way, and the room performed the same slight collective recoil, a season's practice having made it no less visible. He scanned the room with the same flat efficiency. His eyes found Margaret in the same place she had stood in October, near the far wall, in the gown that did not reach her wrists. He looked at her, and she met his gaze, and the room, for a held moment, went very quiet. Lady Stanthorpe stepped forward. "Edward, Miss Fenton has reserved the first dance." He did not answer his mother. He was already walking. Not toward Sophia, who stood with her hand half extended and her smile thinning at its edges. Not toward the orchestra or the refreshment table or the knot of officers who had served with him and who still did not know where to rest their eyes when they faced him. He walked toward Margaret. 3 strides, 4, 5. The crowd parted without deciding to, the way a current divides around a stone. And in the silence the parting made, every person in the room understood that something was being decided in front of them, that the Dowager's whisper campaign had not authorized. He stopped in front of her. The scar was close enough to touch. His jaw was set the way it had been set the night he walked through those doors in October, and yet the rigidity was different now, not armor against the room's rejection, but discipline against the magnitude of what he was about to do. His hand hung at his side, and she could see, in the small tremor of his fingers, the cost of the crossing. He looked at Margaret. She looked at him. Her hands were trembling at her sides, and she did not hide them. "Miss Ellison is to be my wife." 8 words. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The sentence carried across the ballroom the way a stone carries across still water, and every ring it made was specific. Miss Ellison, not Miss Fenton, is to be, not might be, not may become, not is being considered. My wife, not my mother's choice, not the county's preference, not the season's accommodation. Lady Stanthorpe's fan stopped mid-arc. Her mouth opened, and for the first time in Margaret's 19 months of service, no sound came out. Sophia Fenton's hand, the one that had been extended for the dance, lowered slowly to her side, and her face underwent a series of adjustments that ended not in fury, as Margaret might have expected, but in a recognition so quiet it was almost relief. She had known. She had known since the first assembly that he did not look at her the way a man looks at the woman he has chosen, and the Dowager's campaign had been a season-long exercise in pretending otherwise. "Edward," Lady Stanthorpe said. The word cracked at its center. "The banns will be read on Sunday." He did not look at his mother. He looked at Margaret. "If she will have me." Margaret's hands had stopped trembling. She did not curtsy. She did not deflect. She looked at the scar, and at the undamaged eye, and at the face she had met without flinching in October, and had met every morning since in the gray library light. And she said, "Yes, my lord." The room exhaled. Mr. Greaves, the family solicitor, stepped forward from the edge of the crowd where he had stood all evening. A man whose presence at a ball no one had questioned because no one had noticed, and confirmed with a small precise nod that the Earl's instruction regarding the settlement had been prepared for a fortnight. Lady Stanthorpe sat down. No one had offered her a chair. She found one behind her, the way one finds a wall when the ground shifts, and she sat in it, with her diamonds still glittering, and her authority, the authority that had governed this county and this household and this son for 3 decades, settling around her shoulders like a garment she had only just discovered did not fit. She was not destroyed. She was displaced. The room saw it. And the room, which had followed her whisper campaign without objecting, now followed Edward's plain sentence without objecting either. The crowd's loyalty was not to justice. It was to clarity. And he had been clear. Sophia Fenton crossed the room and said very quietly, "I wish you well, Miss Ellison." Her voice was steady. She did not wait for a reply. She collected her wrap and her mother and left through the garden door. And the click of the latch behind her was the last sound the old arrangement made. Edward took Margaret's hand. He did not raise it to his lips. He held it at his side, her fingers inside his, and the warmth of his grip was the first warmth she had felt all evening that did not come from the candles or the hearth or the press of 300 bodies in a room built for 200. It came from him. It came from the same hand that had set a bread roll beside her chair without comment, the same hand that had folded her shawl with a precision she had mistaken for a housekeeper's, the same hand that had held Thomas's book of verse against his chest, like a wound he could not set down. She understood now that he had carried 2 wounds home from Waterloo. The scar the world could see, and the grief the world could not. She had met the first without flinching. She had held the second without asking him to explain it. That, she would learn in the years to come, was why he had chosen her. Not because she was brave, because she was present. Snow was falling when they left the ballroom. Not the decorative frost of a Christmas card, but real snow, heavy and deliberate. The kind that fills a county overnight and makes the morning unrecognizable. The corridors of Stanthorpe Hall were quiet. The servants had withdrawn. The candles in the sconces had burned to half their length, and the shadows they threw were long and soft, and belonged to a house that was learning, room by room, to hold a different shape of warmth. They walked to the library. It was the room where they had started, and it was warm, because someone, Mrs. Hewitt perhaps, had laid the fire before the ball began. 2 chairs faced the hearth. The small table between them held no book, no glass. Nothing except the space where a bread roll had once appeared, without explanation. Edward reached into his coat and drew out the leather-bound volume. Thomas's book of verse. He opened it to the last annotation, the stanza about horses crossing a river at dawn, and he set the book on the table between their chairs, open, the way one sets a door open when the room beyond it is finally safe to enter. "He would have liked you," Edward said. His voice was low. The words were not a declaration. They were the truest thing he had, offered in the plainest language he possessed. Margaret placed her hand on the open page. The handwriting beneath her fingers was Thomas's, and above it, in the margin, Edward's smaller script read, "The morning before." She did not ask him to say more. She did not need him to. The fire cracked and settled. The snow thickened against the window. The library, which had been her refuge and his, and for 7 autumn mornings, theirs, held them now in a silence that was not empty, and was not grief, and was not the absence of speech. It was the sound of 2 people who had finally stopped performing for a room that had never deserved the performance. The candle on the mantel burned low. Margaret leaned her head against the wing of her chair, and Edward, across the small distance between them, did not close the book. He left it open. The verse about the river at dawn faced the ceiling, and the snow fell past the glass. And somewhere in the house a clock struck midnight, and the year turned toward something neither of them had to carry alone. Thank you for staying until the end. If Margaret's story reached you, leave a quiet word below. She would have liked to know she was heard.